behavior, no matter what piece of legislation is passed. Respectfully, sometimes lawmakers have no idea what it means to be a responsible gun owner and to continue to pass laws that either infringe on our rights or make the firearms we are allowed to operate more unsafe. For example, in the state of California, we have a handgun roster in our current AR-15 laws. Currently, AR-15 laws and the modifications that are required actually make these style of rifles that we are legally able to possess more prone to firearm accidents. Additionally, with the California approved handgun roster, you can only purchase older, outdated firearms with older and outdated safety features. What sense does that make? When firearm safety enhancements are made and approved by gun manufacturers often, yet Californians are only prohibited from purchasing the latest and safest firearms? The firearms industry has unfairly been under assault. As a result, my husband and I have dedicated our lives to ensuring our communities have the resources and knowledge they need to be successful in the firearms space. Part of being a responsible gun owner is ensuring that there are resources available for one to be consulted, educated, and trained in a welcoming environment. Being a leader of the National African American Gun Association has allowed me the ability to extend my educational reach from my firearms store to the 40,000 members that are a part of the organization. The Second Amendment is by far one of the most misunderstood and controversial amendments of our Constitution. While many would like to see laws created that would further impede on our right to bear arms, I look forward to using my time today and being able to continue to educate on what it means to be a responsible firearm owner. How many of us successfully use our responsibilities on a daily basis, and how common sense gun knowledge can aid in the retainment of our rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Solomon. I apologize to the committee members and others that the audio quality is so poor. We're going to look into this. Somebody's being paid to communicate with us, and it's not working very well. We owe the respect to the witnesses who made a sacrifice to testify for the committee to provide them with a means of communication we can all hear. Our next witness is Chris Chang. Mr. Chang.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Chris Chang, and I'm honored to join you today representing myself and only myself. As a gay Asian American professional sports shooter, this hearing is very timely and essential to our national conversation on civil rights and our future as a peaceful nation. I'm here today to share my quintessential American story. In 2012, I earned the title of History Channel's Top Shot Season 4 champion. Now, only in America could a self-taught amateur shooter train and win $100,000 and a professional shooting contract. After this, I quit my job at Google and switched careers and focused on firearms, culture, and their role in American history. I earned a master's degree in policy studies from Middlebury College in 2006. Following my Top Shot win, I naturally wanted to research gun policy and history. But I was appalled to discover how gun control can be used as a tool of discrimination. While our Black brothers and sisters have arguably experienced the most negative impacts of gun control through structural racism at the hands of the government, Asian Americans have also been negatively impacted. I will share two examples. First, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first federal law to explicitly prohibit the immigration of people of a particular nationality and set an extremely dangerous precedent for future xenophobic mandates. Second, in response to mounting pressures during World War II, Executive Order 9066 mandated that more than 110,000 innocent Japanese Americans were to be forcibly relocated to internment camps. This order stripped my Japanese ancestors of their rights and their civil liberties. The goal was to keep us unarmed, invisible, and silent. Neither the Chinese Exclusion Act nor the executive order was genuinely successful in increasing domestic safety. Neither will the gun control legislation under consideration. Why are these historic moments important for our conversation today? I'll explain. With the 149% increase in anti-Asian American violence over the past year, Asian Americans are flocking in droves to buy guns, many seeking to purchase their first firearm. There is a real need and imminent threat. We need to defend ourselves, not 3 days or 20 days from now, but right now. I encourage people to be their own first responder because there is no guarantee that help will arrive in time. Universal background checks will not help. I live in San Francisco, and if I want to give or sell a personal firearm to a friend or family member, they must wait 10 days. There should not be a timer delaying when an American wants to exercise their Second Amendment right or any other individual right. Every year, millions of Americans legally purchase firearms. In comparison, only a few thousand criminals or mentally ill individuals acquire guns and commit homicide. Will you let the criminal minority take away the rights of the law-abiding majority, rights which are supposed to be guaranteed to us by our Constitution? I'm against H.R. 8 and H.R. 1446 because they represent a threat to the safety of Asian Americans and all Americans who have an imminent need to defend themselves. Earlier, I spoke about the racist roots of gun control. But what's worse than systemic racist gun control policies? Poorly thought out gun control policies that will negatively impact Americans of all walks of life, all races, genders, and sexual orientations in America. I'll expand. I'm a gay American and have been happily married to my husband of 5.5 years. Today, we see a rise in attacks against Asian Americans, but tomorrow, I might be back here talking about the persistent ongoing violence against LGBTQ Americans. I've lived through how the phrase gay virus to describe AIDS stokes the same fears and dehumanization elicited by the words Chinese virus. This derogatory language contributes to a less safe, less empathetic society. I'll continue speaking out against hate and violence in all forms, and I encourage all Americans to participate in what should be a simple, universal condemnation of hate and violence. We should not be afraid of saying that we will not tolerate it, that it is unacceptable, and that it must stop. At the root of our country's violence is not firearms. The root causes of human violence and hate are many: low self-esteem, lack of mental health resources, community, education, job opportunities, and a lack of humanity. Congress must focus on these actual causes of violence that will make America safer. Thank you for allowing me to address this committee on the importance of gun safety and education and condemn the brutality ravaging our communities today.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. Our next witness is the Waterbury, Connecticut Chief of Police, Fernando Spagnolo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start my testimony, I would like to express my deepest sympathies to the families of all that were lost in the Boulder, Colorado shooting yesterday, especially the family and co-workers of fellow officer Eric Talley, who died bravely trying to protect his community.
Chief, if you could be a little closer perhaps to, so we could hear you a little better. Thank you, sir.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of the Judicial Committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Fernando Spagnolo, and I am the Chief of Police for the city of Waterbury, Connecticut. I have dedicated most of my adult life to public service, sworn to protect the people and uphold the Constitution. I am honored to testify before you today on common sense solutions to prevent gun violence. When the national press talks about gun violence in Connecticut, it usually discusses the brutal and unspeakable murders at Sandy Hook High School in Newtown nearly 10 years ago. The events of that day and the loss of those young children and their teachers shook this nation to its very core. As Chief Administrator of one of the largest police departments in the state of Connecticut, the gun violence that I am most familiar with rarely makes national headlines, but it is just as consequential to the people that it affects. The toll of daily gun violence that disproportionately affects Black and brown communities in cities like mine across this country is a serious problem, and it requires serious solutions. Following Sandy Hook, the people of Connecticut worked together to improve the state's existing laws and develop comprehensive strategies to reduce gun violence, including instituting universal background checks, a common sense policy supported by almost every American. As someone who is responsible for the safety of men and women in uniform, ensuring that all individuals getting a background check before a firearm can be transferred and ensuring enough time is provided for that background check is a top priority of mine. We also expanded the state's assault weapon ban and outlawed sales of new high-capacity ammunition magazines. Likewise, we've heightened protections for victims of domestic violence in Connecticut after Lori Jackson was murdered by her estranged husband with a gun he was able to purchase even though he was under a temporary protective order. A woman is shot and killed every 16 hours in America by a current or former romantic partner, and this is something that needs to be addressed. Most recently, we passed Ethan's Law, a common sense measure that requires guns to be safely stored if children might have access to them. This is a law named in honor of Ethan Song, a 15-year-old boy from Guilford, Connecticut, who died unintentionally when shot with an unsecured gun. Nationwide, nearly 4.6 million children live in homes with access to unsecured and loaded guns, and 8 children are unintentionally shot with an unsecured firearm daily. These policies have been built off Connecticut's existing gun laws, including the nation's first extreme risk law, known in our state as a risk warrant. This allows law enforcement officers to petition a court to temporarily separate an individual from firearms if they pose a risk of imminent harm to themselves or others. According to recent studies, for every 10 to 20 risk warrants that are issued in Connecticut, 1 suicide is prevented. In addition to these common sense laws, in Waterbury, we have invested in community solutions to prevent gun violence. We partner with local leaders, institutions, and nonprofits to help remove the root causes of violence in our community. This includes youth violence prevention programs, one-on-one mentoring programs for high-risk youth, and providing mental health and substance abuse recovery services to members of our community. It also includes an annual gun buyback program, which gets about 100 firearms off the street each year. Additionally, to break the cycle of violence and reduce recidivism, we have post-incarceration violence prevention programs that facilitate services such as housing, healthcare, harm reduction, workforce training, education, and faith-based outreach. This is especially important as the majority of weapons offenses in Waterbury are being committed by individuals with prior weapons convictions. As recently released individuals are being reintegrated into society, often with their support networks in disarray, we must find ways to give them stake in their future and their communities to reduce recidivism and prevent further violence. The efforts to prevent gun violence in Connecticut have worked. In 2019, Waterbury experienced some of its lowest levels of gun violence in years. Statewide, since 2014, we have seen a 41% reduction in gun homicides and a 15% reduction in gun suicides. In the midst of COVID-19 and the huge surge in gun purchases nationwide, incidents of gun violence have skyrocketed in cities all over the country, and Waterbury is no exception to that. Despite the recent setbacks, Connecticut still has one of the lowest gun death rates in the nation. But Connecticut is not an island, and without federal action, we remain at the mercy of states with weak gun laws. Over 2/3 of the crime guns traced by law enforcement in Connecticut come from other states, and gun traffickers will continue to exploit weaknesses in the federal law. Unless we can stop the unchecked flow of guns into cities like mine, preventing cycles of violence will be almost impossible. Gun violence is not inevitable, and for the members of this body, you are in a position to enact sensible solutions that are in line with the Second Amendment. Preventing gun violence requires a comprehensive approach and a strong investment in our communities. I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Chief. Our next witness is Amy Swearer. Amy, thank you for being with us. Please proceed.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished senators. My name is Amy Swearer, and I'm a legal fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Ed Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Imagine with me for a moment a man who walks into his primary care doctor with a whole host of complex, underlying, overlapping health issues. He suffers from a heart defect, he's overweight, he's prone to migraines, probably needs a hip replacement, and he also happens to have a very serious high ankle sprain. Now, is that man's injured ankle a true physical ailment that negatively impacts his overall health? Of course. Should the doctor treat it? Absolutely. Would any sane doctor look at that patient and decide the most prudent course of action is emergency surgery to amputate his leg? Absolutely not. Far too many of the gun control bills pending before Congress are nothing more than the public policy version of this scenario. In short, they would cut off the patient's leg to fix a comparatively minor part of his overall health problems, and then claim that this complete overkill of a treatment somehow left the patient better off in the long run. We cannot do public policy this way. HR 8 on universal background checks is just one example of this, but it is a profound example. HR 8 identifies at its core a legitimate concern: publicly advertised interstate gun sales by private parties. Now, we know that these sales don't play a major role in gun crime. Most would-be criminals don't bother to get their guns through any legitimate or formal source. They primarily use black market gun sales, straw purchases, or informal transfers from friends or family members who already know that they are prohibited persons and that the guns are likely to be used to perpetrate crimes. These are already illegal gun transfers. Now, still, it might make sense to address publicly advertised private sales, but only with the understanding that this is at best a low reward endeavor, and it should be obvious that the law ought to similarly avoid imposing heavy burdens on law-abiding gun owners making other common low-risk gun transfers. HR 8 almost goes out of its way to do the opposite. As I explained in my written submission, there are a number of irrational components to HR 8. But without a doubt, what is most concerning is the way in which HR 8 places significant mental, emotional, and practical barriers between responsible gun owners and low-risk informal gun transfers that save countless lives every year. The bill limits temporary emergency transfers to only when they're necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm, and the transfers can last only as long as immediately necessary. Now, Senators, I have no doubt that the language for this carve-out is well-intentioned, but it's so limited as to serve no real purpose. Nearly 2/3 of all gun deaths every year are suicides. 24,000 Americans killed themselves with firearms in 2019. There's every reason to believe that number is higher for 2020. Mental health awareness and suicide prevention are vital but often difficult conversations for gun owners. There's a very real and frankly a very legitimate fear that if we are open and honest about our mental health difficulties, politicians and gun control activists will use it to impose crushing long-term consequences on our Second Amendment rights. So one very common solution is to seek informal help and to leave firearms with trusted friends or family members the moment we realize that we're not okay, and for as long as we realize we are not okay. I can't stress enough how important this mechanism is for suicide prevention and how often it occurs precisely because it is informal. Many gun owners who might otherwise agree to temporarily hand over their firearms will balk at that same suggestion if it means they have to publicly traipse down to a gun store, wait around for a background check, and legally relinquish title and ownership of their guns to someone else. This is a deeply personal issue for me. Like everyone else, I've had ups and downs in this life. And as a responsible gun owner, I have made that very prudent decision to ask friends to temporarily take my guns when I've been down. The last thing I would have needed was the government getting in the way of me doing the right thing. And I speak on behalf of countless other gun owners who have made this same responsible decision under similar circumstances, but who would be terrified of admitting that to anyone, much less to the federal government. Now, Mrs. Brule testified about a very real problem with existing law that to her is not small in scope because it shook the foundations of her entire world. And there are certainly appropriate ways of addressing and narrowly tailoring legislation to address that problem. But this is not it. HR 8, as written, will get gun owners killed because it will discourage them from taking reasonable and common sense steps the moment they realize they may not in fact be okay. There are many other similar problems with so many other gun control bills, and I genuinely look forward to talking about how to fix those problems and find alternate solutions. But with respect to HR 8 in particular, please do not encourage gun owners to wait until they're in imminent danger to take life-saving actions. This is not a choice between thoughts and prayers and doing something, regardless of how impractical that something is and how poorly it works in real-world scenarios. This is the world's greatest deliberative body. Surely we can do better than making criminals of people who do the right things. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Swear. Next witness is Dr. Susanna Hupp. Dr. Hupp.
There we go. Good morning. My name is Susanna Hupp, and this is my own testimony. I'm representing only myself this morning. And I need to apologize to some of you in advance that have heard my testimony before. It really doesn't change. Several years ago, I was with my parents at a local cafeteria, and somebody drove his truck through a floor-to-ceiling window, knocked over a number of tables on his way in, and we, of course, thought it was an accident. My parents and I actually got up to try to help the people that he had knocked over, and then we heard gunshots. And I will tell you, it took a good 45 seconds, which is an eternity, to realize that the guy was simply going to walk around and shoot people. Back then, these mass shootings weren't happening, and that just wasn't something that came to my mind immediately. When I did realize what was happening, my father and I both got down on the floor. We put the table up in front of us. My mother was down behind us, and I reached for my purse because I used to carry a gun in my purse. And at that time in the state of Texas, that was illegal. A few months prior to this event, I had begun to leave my gun out in my car because I was concerned about losing my license to practice chiropractic. So I watched completely helplessly as this man walked around the room and shot people. He executed people like they were fish in a barrel. When my father thought he had an opportunity, he rose up and he ran at the man. But the guy had complete control over the situation, and he just simply turned and shot my father in the chest. When I saw what I thought was a chance, I was able to run out a back window that somebody had broken out. I thought my mother followed me, but I later found out from the police officers, who, by the way, were one building away, that she had crawled out into the open where my dad lay. She cradled him until the gunman got back around to her. He put a gun to her head. They said she looked up at him, put her head down, and the man pulled the trigger. That's how the cops knew who the gunman was. My parents had just had their 47th wedding anniversary, and Mom wasn't going anywhere without Dad. I was very angry. And of course, when I talk about it, even now, I get very angry. Believe it or not, I'm not mad at the guy that did it, because in my opinion, that's somebody who is sick. The cops said all they had to do was fire a shot into the ceiling, and he rabbited to a back bathroom alcove area, exchanged some gunfire with them, and then put a bullet in his own head. I was mad as hell at my legislators, because they had legislated me and others in that restaurant out of the right to be able to defend ourselves. I had a perfect place to prop my hand. I had a clear shot at the guy, but I was worried about losing my license instead of worrying about my life. Since then, of course, we've changed those laws in Texas and all across the nation. Now people can defend themselves in most places. Most of the mass shootings that have occurred to this date have been in places where people have been told they can't carry a gun. That's what these guys want. They want to rack up a high body bag count. They don't want any place where somebody can fire back at them. A gun isn't a guarantee, of course. It changes the odds, that's all. And I would say if guns are the problem, then why don't we see these mass shootings at the dreaded gun show or NRA conventions, places where there are thousands of guns in the hands of at least as many law-abiding citizens? You talk about universal background checks, and I am frankly completely against them, and here's why. Eventually, universal background checks become a de facto registration. And even if no one on the dais today is interested in confiscating guns, It certainly makes it fertile ground for some future despot. There are things that can be done. A number of them I put in my written testimony, and I won't bore you with it now, but they're there. There are things that can be done. Let me just finish by saying 350 million guns in America last year didn't hurt anyone. And I think that is a staggering statistic. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Hupp. Our last witness is Robin Thomas. Ms. Thomas.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Robin Thomas, and I'm the Executive Director of the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Giffords Law Center was formed more than 25 years ago after a mass shooting at a San Francisco law firm, and renamed for former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords after joining forces with the organization that she leads. I've been the Executive Director at the Law Center since 2006. This past week, we saw a horrible string of shootings. 10 people, including a law enforcement officer in Boulder, Colorado yesterday. Last Tuesday, 9 people were shot and 8 killed at 3 spas in the Atlanta area. A shocking example of the disturbing increase in violence against the Asian American community. Over the last year, communities have suffered not only from COVID-19, but also from gun violence, a public health crisis that has surged in all of its forms. Suicides have increased dramatically in communities from Philadelphia to Chicago. Domestic violence has also intensified, with many localities reporting more calls to hotlines and police in response to incidents of abuse. Many metropolitan areas have experienced spikes in community violence, with over a dozen cities reporting increases in homicides of 50% or more. We cannot allow this violence to continue for the next generation. Proposed gun law reforms, many of which have been introduced in this Congress, and which enjoy widespread public support, would make a difference. These include policies such as universal background checks, extreme risk protection laws, and prohibitions on firearm access to those who commit domestic abuse or hate crimes. They also include proposals to increase funding for critical community violence intervention work, public health research, and for law enforcement. These proposals are a crucial part of an appropriate public health approach focused on prevention, proportional to the seriousness of this issue, and based on the data and research we have for these solutions. Despite what the gun lobby may argue, there is no constitutional impediment to passing life-saving gun laws. Courts across the country have ruled repeatedly that the Second Amendment does not stand in the way of passing stronger gun laws, and the US Supreme Court itself made clear that the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited, and has never protected a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. I know some are eager to make the case that we are only interested in taking away firearms from law-abiding Americans or making it difficult for law enforcement to do their jobs. I want to be clear that we are not advocating for either. But our existing gun laws are irrationally limited, loophole-ridden, and inadequate. And these deficiencies hamper law enforcement's ability to effectively prevent acts of gun violence in our American communities. Everyone should be troubled by the levels of gun violence that we experience, and it's impossible to ignore the reality that when we have more guns, we have more gun violence. We can meaningfully address this by updating our gun laws to ensure both law-abiding Americans have a right to gun ownership, and we can prevent these horrific acts of gun violence that are occurring on a daily basis. Since the founding of our country, gun rights have always coexisted with gun regulations, and the need to protect public safety has always gone hand in hand with Americans' right to own guns. Heller's explicit recognition that a broad range of gun laws are fully consistent with the Second Amendment is in keeping with more than 200 years of the United States reached their highest level in almost 40 years, with 40,000 Americans dying from gun violence in 2019. Unfortunately, it's a problem unique to our country. Americans are 25 times more likely to be killed by a gun than people in other developed nations. But it's a problem that has solutions. While one single law will never stop all gun violence, we know that strong gun laws will save lives. The only thing standing in the way of laws that prevent needless injuries and death and enjoy the support of an overwhelming majority of Americans is the absence of political will to act. So today, I ask all members of this committee and Congress as a whole to recommit themselves to making progress and taking action to reduce gun violence in this country. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Let me start with Dr. Rogers. We face two realities, certainly from a Chicago perspective, that a lot of the gun violence has been spawned by young people, gangs, and communities that are awash in guns. You know what I'm speaking of, in South Side, West Side of Chicago, and many other places. We also know that many of the shooters have a history, at least a history of adverse childhood experiences. Could you explain to us that issue of trauma and the likelihood that it will lead to shooters and victims?
Thank you, Dr. Durbin. Many people know the phrase or have heard the phrase, hurt people, and work from John Rich and Ted Kerben in Philadelphia has shown repeatedly that people who have been experiencing trauma from adverse childhood experiences of trauma, be it related to homelessness, food insecurity, and other social challenges, are more likely to be at risk of experiencing trauma in all its forms, be it child abuse, domestic violence, or other forms of trauma. Unfortunately, those who have been victims of gun violence, we also know have a higher risk of having repeated episodes of gun violence. And in many ways, those are the highest risk individuals. And we need to find ways of addressing those high risk individuals in economically depressed communities that are the highest risk for being victims of violence, but also perpetrators of violence.
Now, Doctor, I hate to interrupt you, but 18 months ago, that would have been an answer that would have been really spot on. Now I want you to add COVID-19 into the equation.
Without a doubt, the COVID-19 pandemic, for a whole host of reasons related to social isolation, higher rates of unemployment, and other challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, has put incredible pressure on distressed communities. High rates of unemployment, higher rates of mental unwellness, if you will, has perpetuated more gun violence. We've seen in the city of Chicago and many cities across the country, including LA and Philadelphia, 50% increase in the rate of gun violence. And we need more targeted interventions to try to address this problem. The problem, unfortunately, every day is not going away. We know that over 100 people will die today of gun-related homicides and suicides.
So let me ask you this question. A child who has gone through these adverse childhood experiences and a childhood that none of us wish on anyone, is that child a lost soul? Is there any possible redemption in terms of medical treatment or mental health treatment?
I think we often, every child is an opportunity, and we need to invest in our children because those children are the ones who become adults and productive members of our society. Unfortunately, oftentimes those trauma is not recognized, and the impact of that trauma and intergenerational trauma, such as poverty and racism, is not addressed. By finding ways of actually providing trauma-informed care to individuals, be it in schools and in communities, we can have an impact and prevent needless intentional gun violence and other forms of trauma.
Thank you. Chief Spagnola, so far this year, 16 Chicago police officers have been either shot or shot at in the line of duty. Last week alone, 3 officers were shot and injured. We know what happened last night in Boulder. The policeman who responded to the scene, Eric Talley, father of 7, lost his life. Can you talk about the risk that law enforcement officers face while America is seeing record numbers of guns that are being sold? And also, should a gun be sold to an unknown person without that person passing a criminal background check?
Mr. Chairman, I believe strongly in the background check process. It's something that works quite well here in Connecticut. It gives us an opportunity to make sure that the person that's actually purchasing the gun has gone through a pretty strict background check, and all the databases have been checked to make sure that they're not a prohibited person. One of my greatest concerns for the men and women that service the community here in Waterbury is the amount of guns that they face on the street on a daily basis. Our police officers are taking an average of 1 to 2 guns a day, illegal guns a day, off the streets of Waterbury. Now, we're a community of about 115,000 people here in Connecticut, so I can only imagine what my colleagues face in larger urban areas across the country. This is a significant issue for us and a great concern for our officers to be faced with these amount of weapons that are on the street. We've seen a huge increase in spike in the amount of concealed weapons permits that have been applied for, over a 300% increase in weapons permits applied for here in the city over the course of 2020. And we've also seen a tremendous uptick in the amount of guns that have been sold. The issue that we have is that many guns are purchased here and they are straw purchases. They end up in the hands of prohibited persons, and then they're used in crimes of violence in our community.
Thanks, Chief. Thanks, Chief. Senator Grassley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask my questions in this order: Chang, Solomon, Schwer, and Huff, if I get to all of you. Mr. Chang, thank you for your testimony about the needs to vulnerable communities to protect themselves. Can you think of any instance where Asian Americans have needed to use firearms to protect themselves?
Absolutely. We don't have to look any farther back than the 1992 LA riots. And in Koreatown, when LA was burning and Koreatown was under attack, and they called the LAPD for help. And the LAPD was under-resourced and unavailable to come to the aid of Korean Americans in Koreatown. So what did they do? Korean Americans utilized their Second Amendment rights and took their own personal firearms and protected their businesses, their lives, and their community.
When police departments are defunded, it is often communities of color that are most impacted. So, Mr. Chang, how does this impact the need for self-defense with firearms?
If we look back at the past year and a half or so with COVID-19, it's been a pressure cooker for all of us to see the civil unrest, the violence that has enraptured our country. And when you couple that with calls for defunding the police and taking law enforcement officers off the street, demoralizing them, dehumanizing them, it makes citizens like me feel less safe. And if I can't have law enforcement there to keep the peace in my community, then it is a rational conclusion that individual citizens like myself would opt to utilize my Second Amendment right to purchase a firearm and use that firearm in lawful and legal self-defense.
Okay. Ms. Solomon, you're a leader in the National African American Gun Association. So from your position, California is known to be a restrictive state in terms of gun control. Can you tell us about California's approach to gun control, which many are trying to reproduce on the federal level, and whether you think that approach is effective?
Here in California, there are a lot of measures that we do see being paired from the federal perspective. Some that can work, that works here, the private party transfer process where all gun sales do have to go through a dealer. That works well, but there's other things that essentially price people in my community out of being able to protect themselves. We don't have a blanket, a concealed carry weapons permit system here. Those who live in affluent areas like Orange County or Ventura County can protect themselves better than someone who lives in Los Angeles County, where Black and brown people mostly live. So unfortunately, the gun control measures that have happened here in California essentially affects people of my community more so than people of other communities where there are strained relationships with people in my community and law enforcement.
I'm going to have a second question for you if I have time. Otherwise, I'll submit in writing because I want to go to Ms. Ware. We've heard a little about the universal background checks, H.R. 8, and the extended background investigation bill, H.R. 1446. Would these bills be effective in reducing gun violence?
Senator, thank you for your question. So when we're talking about gun violence generally, As I mentioned in my oral testimony, there's a real balance between how HR in particular addresses a very small part of the problem in publicly advertised private sales and how it would detrimentally impact a larger part of the problem, which is gun suicides. Normally, when people bring up background checks and private gun sales in particular, they're referencing impacts on mass public shootings. And I think it's important to recognize that with perhaps only one exception, these would not have played any meaningful role in preventing any mass public shooting in recent history, perhaps, though I think it's questionable, the exception being the Odessa Midland shooting a couple years ago. The real problem is that most of these mass shooters actually pass background checks to begin with, that there isn't this sort of intermediate option for when they're exhibiting very serious signs of being unstable and violent toward themselves or others. So that's actually more so than background checks for prohibited persons. When we're talking about mass public shootings, the real issue is that many of these people, far too many, pass those background checks in the first place.
Okay, I've just got 5 seconds left, so let me ask Dr. Huff. Thank you for sharing your personal story with us. What measures do you believe would be best help others to avoid becoming victims of gun violence?
Well, quite honestly, I think, the old Boy Scout motto, always be prepared. I teach my sons when we walk into a restaurant, I used to have them close their eyes and would ask them, where are the exits? You need to be able to act fast. I think people should be able to protect themselves to the best of their ability. I think communities of color and communities that are of minority religious entities should be very wary of universal background checks for the same reason that I mentioned earlier. It does create a de facto gun registration. And then at any point in the future, and Lord knows history has shown us that bad things happen. We talked earlier about the folks of Japanese descent during World War II. We've certainly seen it with the Jewish communities and with African American communities. So I think those folks in particular should be very wary of universal background checks. Anytime we have a term like common sense gun laws, I think most of us find it kind of humorous because it's tagged common sense so that you don't want to vote against it, right? But it's anything but common sense, quite frankly. There are certainly things we can do. Again, in my written testimony, my husband talked about, my husband is a criminal psychologist, and he talks about threat assessments and how task forces can be formed that would have prevented a number of these things, like in Aurora and in Sutherland Springs, where people knew that these people were messed up before they ever got hold of a gun. They could have been prevented.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. I'd like to explain to the witnesses and others that we have a roll call beginning in just a minute or two. I'm going to leave to go to the floor to vote. Senator Blumenthal is going to preside. And in the meantime, I'm going to recognize Senator Leahy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to go back to Chief Spagnuolo, if I might. I should note that I'm a gun owner. I go through background checks, whether I'm buying a pistol or a rifle in Vermont. It's usually somebody who's known me, selling to me, known me my whole life. But I have no problem with that, with a background check. And I worry about the straw purchases. I knew when I was a prosecutor, and I've seen it since, so many guns are bought in straw purchases and end up in criminal hands. There's no federal law that adequately addresses this type of firearms trafficking. There's more we can do to stop these purchases. Yesterday, I introduced a bill to do just that with Senator Collins of Maine and Chairman Durbin. The last time we had that bill up before the Senate, it got 58 votes and bipartisan votes. It's supported by a broad range of law enforcement organizations. So, Chief Spagnuolo, do you agree that legislation explicitly targeting straw purchases will help law enforcement keep firearms out of the hands of dangerous criminals?
Yes, I do. I think that would be one step, Senator, in the process. We work closely with the United States Attorney's Office here in the District of Connecticut, looking at straw purchases and having local and state investigations adopted by the U.S. Attorney for federal prosecution under the Project Safe Neighborhood Doctrine, and it works quite well. The thing is in Connecticut here, we have a background process, and there's plenty of guns that are sold, and then, as I said, forensically, we're able to link these guns into shootings that are happening in our community, and it's really devastating.
When I was chief law enforcement officer of my county, I heard from so many the police who say they feel safer when fewer guns end up in the hands of criminals. It's kind of an easy question. I assume you felt the same way the police officers who are under my jurisdiction felt.
Absolutely, Senator.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce in the record letters supporting our legislation from 4 law enforcement agencies: the National Fraternal Order of Police, the Major Cities Chiefs Association, National Sheriff's Association, and the National District Attorneys Association.
Without objection.
And if I could ask Robin Thomas, since 1996, Congress explicitly prohibited federal agencies from researching the gun violence epidemic. The ban was driven by the bogus conspiracy theory that federal research into gun violence would lead to a federal assault on Second Amendment rights. When I was chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, I helped end the funding drought in 2019. We appropriated $25 million to the CDC and NIH to study gun violence from a public health perspective. We treat any other epidemic killing tens of thousands of Americans each year as a public health epidemic. Ms. Thomas, why is it so important for the federal government to treat and research gun violence as a public health epidemic? Why is it vital for Congress to fund that?
Thank you for your question, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. We are so appreciative of the new funding, $25 million, which is going to look at this issue more carefully. We know from early studies in the early 90s, initially on this issue, that when we study and look at rates of gun violence and the types of measures that can be put in place to reduce it, that we get really interesting and important information about gun storage, about gun sales, about limitations on guns that are appropriate to reducing violence. That's why the Dickey Amendment was put in place, to ensure that we don't have research in order to be able to speak knowledgeably about the ways we can reduce it. So we really look forward to seeing the outcome of this research, which we know because we do have private research that's been coming out of really high-end universities across the country showing the positive impact that gun laws make in reducing gun violence, whether it's limitations including background checks or permit to purchase laws, safe storage laws, and so many more. So this is essential because without this research to show the impact, it makes it a difficult argument. And we know when research is done, it shows the impact of these laws and helps us to have an educated, informed conversation as a country about what actually works.
And Ms. Thomas, I'm going to submit another question to you for the record if I can, because I also wanted to ask Chief Spagnuolo, the Congress prohibits the ATF from making gun records in its possession digitally searchable. That means they're going through millions of paper records that are stored in cardboard boxes by hand. It's absolutely ridiculous. Do you believe that empowering the ATF to utilize 21st century tools like digital searches would assist law enforcement agencies trying to trace guns used in crimes?
Yes, Senator. Gun tracing is an important part of investigations that we participate in with gun crime, and anything to progress that and bring it up to today's technology would be beneficial to law enforcement.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Leahy. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chang, I'd like to start with you. In your testimony, you talk a little bit about the racist roots of gun control. And I wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit further on this and talk to us a little bit about the disproportionate harms that you think can be inflicted on minority groups of various stripes, including LGBTQ communities by gun control, aggressive gun control policies of the sort that are often pushed these days, including things like universal background checks and increased waiting periods?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So I think a lot of gun control laws under consideration that are passed are always well-intentioned, right? Well-meaning, and I think we are all united in the fact that we want to reduce the violence that we see in our country. Like I mentioned with Executive Order 9066 as one of many examples, it was under that executive order was ordered under the guise of public safety and national security, yet it took a marginalized community, our Japanese American citizens, and unconstitutionally put them in internment camps. I think the main point is we have this tendency to create the other, right? And when we otherize people, we stop treating them like human beings, and then we stop saying that they have the rights bestowed upon them by the US Constitution. And so whether it's with Japanese Americans or any other Asian Americans or LGBTQ Americans, it's us today, but it's going to be someone else tomorrow. So this isn't just a problem for the Asian American community or the LGBT community, but when there are gun control bills under consideration, it threatens every single American's right to defend themselves from real imminent threats. And that's what frightens me about the gun control legislation in front of this body today.
Very often, not only in American history, but even prior to American history, we've seen that it's rarely the empowered, very rarely the wealthy or those with political connections to the government who have their rights interfered with. This goes back many centuries. Charles II in England, in something called the Game Act, enacted in 1671, it took away gun rights of commoners. 17 years later, in 1688, William and Mary brought into the English Bill of Rights legislation that protected gun ownership rights for commoners, but made clear that it applied only to Protestants. In other words, those who are disenfranchised, those who are not among the wealthy elite or the most well-connected, are usually those in any society, certainly going back hundreds of years in our legal traditions. Those are very often not the people whose rights are most seriously restricted. The wealthy and the well-connected end up doing okay. Now, Dr. Hupp, I appreciate you joining us today, and it's good to hear your voice again and to hear your insights on this. Your story is nothing short of tragic and heartbreaking. Now, the right of individual Americans to keep and bear arms was appropriately considered by our founding fathers so fundamental and so associated with the English legal tradition that informed their decision-making that they chose to put it into the Constitution in the Second Amendment. Recently, my home state of Utah became the 17th state to enact constitutional concealed carry legislation, allowing anyone 21 years of age or older who's legally allowed to possess a firearm to concealed carry, subject to certain exceptions. Dr. Hupp, could you explain why you think it's in the public interest, setting aside for a moment the constitutional questions, but why is it in the public interest to allow all law-abiding Americans to carry firearms?
Oh, heavens, that becomes so deep. I think you and Mr. Cheng put it very clearly when you're looking at the broader picture. I know that historically, bad things can happen. And I think it's a preventive for a future despotic actions. Makes it very difficult for someone to come in and do bad things to groups of people when they can fight back. As individuals, I think we see so many people who are in persecuted classes. I think the the LBGQ. I forget all the letters now, but I think those persecuted classes are particularly in need of protection, personal protection. I think it's important that the bad guys don't know where the guns are. I think the more that we see these mass shootings, we're seeing them in places where people, again, are not allowed to protect themselves. I think when we see them in schools, that's a perfect example. It's always bothered me that my sister's a teacher. She can protect herself at the Walmart, across the street from the school, where there are mothers pushing strollers. And yet, for some reason, society has said, we don't trust you the minute you cross the street and go into your classroom. And yet, that's where the bad guys go to kill people. So I think the more good people that are armed, the better.
In other words, a lot of this has to do with the fact that if we didn't have these rights, the government would have a certain monopoly on the use of force. Now, if you live in a neighborhood that's well secured, that's behind a gate, if you can afford your own private security, or if you're in a neighborhood that for one reason or another, the police monitor regularly, this might have a very different set of implications than it would if you don't live in one of those communities. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely would agree with that. And I've noticed that many of the people that are supportive of gun control have their own security details. Unfortunately, I don't have that.
Charles II and William and Mary certainly had their own as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Lee. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. One proposal to address gun violence is by passing extreme risk laws. My state, California, did just that. These laws allow family members and law enforcement to go to court to get temporary lawful orders to prevent people from purchasing or possessing firearms if they are a danger to themselves or others. Before each of the tragedies in Tucson, Aurora, Navy Yard, and Santa Barbara, family members and law enforcement saw warning signs, but they were powerless to stop the shooter from getting a firearm. Sadly, this is really all too common. A recent analysis of mass shootings in the United States between 2009 and 19 found that in 54% of those shootings, the shooter had shown warning signs. So here's the question, and I'd like to have each of you briefly address it. Do you believe that extreme risk laws would help reduce gun violence on a national level? Please.
Okay, I'll start on the side. Absolutely, yes. Extreme risk protective orders fully comply with due process. They are an incredibly effective tool for family members and law enforcement, both in preventing suicide, which is the thing that takes the most American lives from gun violence, and also from preventing mass shootings. A recent study in California identified at least 21 instances in which mass shootings had been prevented by the use of extreme risk protective orders. And the chief pointed to data coming out of Connecticut about the reduction in suicide directly attributable to extreme risk protective orders. So when these measures are approached in a way that utilizes full due process, judicial officers, testimony under oath, and a full and fair hearing within a short amount of time, there's absolutely no reason we shouldn't have this applying across the entire country to help prevent suicides, mass shootings, and other violence.
Thank you. Anybody else on that question? Please go ahead.
If I may, Geneva Solomon here. I do agree with what she said, with the Giffords Law Office. However, we have to be careful with how we, implement those laws. Oftentimes, extreme risk and red flag laws affect people more within minority communities, because there is still a stigma attached to those who are within minority communities practicing responsible gun ownership as being irresponsible. So although the family member may call and bring in law enforcement, that law enforcement officer may not stress or implement equally when it's someone from a minority group and then someone from, a more affluent area. So oftentimes, those within the Black and brown community are affected more by those red flag laws. And sometimes guns are taken away from them when they can, and they won't be able to protect themselves.
Anybody else? Yes, please.
Senator, I would like to address that as well. This is, I think, one of those areas where there is at least room for significant bipartisan support on this, precisely because when you look at the general idea of targeted interventions of people who are showing these risk factors, we're dealing with things that, again, are targeted and not broadly impacting people who are not likely to be a danger to themselves or others. And when you look specifically at mass public shootings, as I mentioned to Senator Grassley earlier, the biggest problem is that most of these individuals, despite these warning signs, were able to pass background checks and obtain their
I'm
firearms
sorry,
legally.
we're able to,
Were able to pass background checks. They were not prohibited persons because they hadn't yet reached what I'd consider either a mental health crisis or had yet committed a felony under federal law. So this idea of targeted interventions directed at people who haven't yet reached that crisis point, I think is a very important aspect of addressing very important parts of the problem. Now, again, with that, there needs to be adequate due process. I think one of the biggest problems with so many of the red flag laws on the books is that they don't adequately address due process concerns, that there are very low standards, very low bars for essentially taking away people's guns on the basis of perhaps, grieved former lovers or people who are just upset. And it can be a very expensive, time-consuming process for innocent persons to go through. So that needs to be balanced with that same targeted intervention approach.
thank you.
And I would add that.
This is Susanna Hupp. Senator Feinstein, I am thrilled to say this is an area that you and I can actually agree upon, and I could certainly work with you on this. I'm not familiar with the piece of legislation that you're actually talking about. I agree with the last speaker that obviously we always are concerned that laws like that can be misused. Again, in my written testimony, I talked about the difference between threat assessment versus risk assessment, and task forces at a statewide level could be put in place that could implement some very good rules on this, and I think would prevent a number of future events.
Thank you.
Senator
That's
Feinstein, this is Robin Brule. Thank you for the question. Yes, we think they will. Extreme risk protection order laws allow family members and law enforcement to have tools to take action with due process before warning signs escalate to tragedies.
And I would finally add that extreme risk protection orders will indeed decrease the amount of both suicides and homicides. We disproportionately talk about mass shootings, but every day 100 people die from gun-related suicide or homicide. And oftentimes, unfortunately, that involves a domestic violence situation where an estranged boyfriend or husband will try to take the life of their partner. And intimate partner violence is an unfortunate reality every day in America. Last time I was on call, a boyfriend at 5 o'clock in the morning came to his girlfriend's house and shot through the door, trying to take her life. And extreme risk protection orders will help prevent those events.
Thank you.
Senator, I know we're running out of time here, but if I may just very quickly add one more point. So I think it's important to also recognize an aspect of these targeted interventions that has to deal with, I think, that the lack of trust right now between the Second Amendment and gun owning community and a lot of politicians and gun control advocates. There's this feeling that people are simply just out to take our guns through whatever means necessary. And I think one of the ways of addressing that, especially in building that trust back, especially within the concept of red flag laws, is to ensure that these laws focus on not just taking away people's guns when they are showing these warning signs, but that they're hooked up with existing mental health, treatment, addiction, family court system infrastructure, so that we're not just taking away guns, but then directing people toward help and toward treatment, because ultimately the goal of these should be getting people back to a point where they aren't dangerous, where they can have their rights fully restored to them. Because in the long run, that's going to benefit society much more. It's going to benefit that individual. And that helps restore that broken trust between the gun owning community and a lot of politicians and gun control activists.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you.
I will be introducing a bill.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. I would just note that to the last point that was made, that the risk warrant law in Connecticut provides for that kind of access to help in the course of the due process that's afforded whoever is separated from a firearm. And Senator Lindsey Graham and myself have actually offered a bipartisan version of this risk warrant law in past Congresses. I hope that I will have a Republican partner in this effort again during this session, because risk warrant laws have been shown, as Chief Spagnola testified very powerfully, to save lives, not only suicides, but in mass shootings and other kinds of problems. And I'm very hopeful that Connecticut's model law, which was passed the first in the nation before Sandy Hook, could actually be an example for others to follow. There are 19 states that have it now, including Florida in the wake of Parkland. And I think it's one of the most promising areas of progress on a bipartisan basis. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hupp, thank you very much for telling your story. Your story is powerful. You and I have known each other a long time. Your story is one that I believe anyone assessing the horror of gun violence needs to hear and needs to confront. And Ms. Hupp, what I would ask you is many members of this committee believe that the right policy decision is to enact strict federal laws to make it harder for law-abiding citizens to own firearms. Do you believe, in your experience, in your judgment, that disarming law-abiding citizens makes our communities any safer?
I absolutely believe that disarming the average citizen makes for a much more unsafe society. Now your wheelchair-bound grandmother cannot protect herself from the thugs who want to take her Social Security check. If she has a weapon, now she's on equal footing.
Mr. Cheng, gun sales in the United States skyrocketed in 2020, including among minority groups. According to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, firearms sales during the first half of 2020 increased year over year by 51.9% for whites, 58.2% for African Americans, 49.4% for Hispanics, and 42.9% for Asian Americans. Why do you think that is?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. The fear in the Asian American community is palpable and it's real. And Asian Americans are waking up to the fact that we are Americans and we have the right to exercise our right to self-defense. And if we want to use a firearm, that should be our choice. And it shouldn't be up to the government to decide or determine how and when we decide to defend ourselves. And so I want to send a very clear message to Asian Americans that we are Americans too. And we should be exercising every single one of our rights as American citizens. And I want everyone to speak up and contribute to this critical debate and discussion that we're having today about keeping our country safe and happy, and let everybody live the American dream that we all want and we aspire to attain.
Thank you, Mr. Cheng. I think that was a powerful and important message. Do you believe that the right to keep and bear arms is a civil right? And to what extent do you think the additional firearms purchases last year were motivated in part by the riots we saw across the country as city after city in our country burned, as stores were looted, as police officers were murdered? To what extent do you think individual citizens wanted to be able to protect their own homes and their own businesses and their own families in the wake of the violence they were seeing unfold across our country?
Yeah, putting the pieces together, a constant stream of civil unrest, of buildings and homes being burned, of people of all races being attacked, the stress of being quarantined during COVID, talk about defunding the police, demoralizing law enforcement, encouraging them to retire early or just quit altogether. Because why would a law enforcement officer want to put their life on the line for a public that doesn't want them? I can empathize with that. And so put on top of that, the 149% increase in anti-Asian American violence, you betcha. Asian Americans are putting all these pieces together, just like all Americans are saying, this is a more dangerous society that we've experienced over the past year and that we're experiencing now. And unfortunately, it's only getting worse. And I don't want that, and nobody else wants that. But there is a logical conclusion that if you're going to defund the police, and if there's going to be increased violence, and if I need to be my own first responder, that I need to have a firearm to defend myself and my family.
Okay, thank you. Final question, Ms. Hupp. A couple of weeks ago, I introduced an amendment along with Bill Cassidy that would have provided that the $1,400 stimulus checks going out from the government not go to criminals, not go to criminals who are currently incarcerated, not go to mass murderers and rapists and child molesters, who are currently in prison. We voted on it in the Senate floor. Every Senate Democrat voted no, and it's failed by a single vote, which means if even a single Democrat had supported that amendment, we would not be currently sending U.S. taxpayer checks to violent criminals, including mass murderers, including presumably the shooter in Atlanta, the shooter in Boulder, including the shooter in the Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, including potentially the shooter in Santa Fe and other mass shooters who are currently incarcerated. Ms. Hupp, what do you think of the federal government sending $1,400 checks to mass murderers who carried out acts of gun violence?
So let me get this straight. I don't get a stimulus check. One of my sons doesn't get a stimulus check, but the murderer does. I'm shocked. I'm horrified. I cannot understand what possible reason anyone would have to vote against that, Senator Cruz. I don't get it.
Thank you.
Because we are on a roll call, several members are in transit. And so we're going to give Senator Tillis an opportunity now, and we'll catch up on the Democratic side as senators appear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses who are with us today. And Senator Cruz, I want to thank you for, I want to fully associate myself with your opening comments. And with Cruz Grassley being reintroduced, it is something that I would like to get on if you are working to get co-sponsors. So would like to do that as part of its introduction. Mr. Chairman, since I've been here for 6 years now, 6.5 years, the events of Boulder, Colorado are not the first one that we've had in those 6 years. They're a very sad situation. The thing that I worry about is that this is a time when you think that we would all come together on something that's common sense and makes progress, but it tends to be the time to where we go into our corners and we make no progress. And I think that Grassley Cruz is a step in the right direction, and I hope that it is something that we can try and work on. We don't know much about the shooter in Boulder. My guess is it's going to follow many of the same patterns that we've seen with other mass shootings. There were probably signs that if we only had better resources for law enforcement, we may have been able to identify if the parents or friends or associates of the shooter had spoken up, there could have been interventions to prevent it. I, for one, do not think that a discussion around increasing gun control alone is too simplistic for us to think we're going to make any real progress on a matter that we hopefully in this Congress will make progress on. So I guess the the challenge that I have with those who think we should just have indiscriminate red flag laws without any due process to be initiated by persons outside of law enforcement, they don't make sense to me. Do they make sense to you, Mr. Chen?
My concern about extreme risk protective orders is that right now it's a patchwork of different approaches by states, and it's just inconsistent depending on what state you live in. The other concern I have, to touch upon your point, Senator, is that who should be trusted to make a final adjudication and determination whether someone is truly a risk? Is that a judge? Is that a law enforcement officer? Should that be a family member or a friend? But who actually knows this person well? Who has who might have a negative ulterior motive, right? To say, I'm a disgruntled lover, or I'm upset at you for whatever reason, and therefore I'm going to leverage an extreme risk protective order to take away your Second Amendment rights. So at a high level, I agree that there's an opportunity here, and
What would that look like?
I think it is probably up to this body to help resolve these differences in the patchwork, right, that we're seeing across different states. And that is a tall order. But if we take best practices that we're seeing from different states, that's, I think, where we should first look. But it is a balance of the individual right versus the right of the government to take away someone's rights at the on behalf of public safety. And that's always the difficult challenge.
Ms. Swear?
Thank you, Senator. I agree that there are indeed, especially as they're written in a lot of states, significant due process concerns. I think one thing we can do is look at similar types of frameworks that we already have in place that protect due process in a more civil, not criminal context. And one of those is, in fact, the mental health civil commitment procedures. So in most states, these require robust forms of due process. There's a right to an attorney, there's a right to cross-examination, there's a right to testify on your own behalf. They use standards of clear and convincing evidence, which are fairly robust. And I think using that framework rather than a lower, less robust framework is at least a starting point, because there is a longstanding both judicial review of these procedures against the Constitution, but it's also something that we're familiar with, that we know how to run, at least in terms of the framework of due process.
Ms. Solomon?
Thank you for including me. One of the things that I haven't heard mentioned when we talk about red flag laws is the amount of money that would cost to defend yourself when that happens. As a federal licensed dealer here in California, we have seen people who have relinquished their firearms over to us, and we've heard their stories about how costly it has been due to a disgruntled relationship, due to an encounter that they had with law enforcement, and they spend countless amounts of money and a lot of time in court just to get their firearms back 2-3 years later. So we have to address that. Yes, there should be due process, but when we start to put a cost to that, then we get more into what I have been continually saying, is we begin to price people out of being able to protect themselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Again, we have no Democratic members currently in the room, and I'd like to turn to Senator Cotton and recognize him.
First, I want to begin by saying that we're all saddened by the terrible shooting in Boulder, Colorado yesterday. Like so many Americans, I'm praying for the victims of this crime, especially for the family of Officer Eric Talley. I gather Mr. Talley left his work as an information technology professor at the age of 40 after a friend died in a DUI crash because he wanted to serve the public. He leaves behind a wife and 7 children. So we offer the deepest condolences to them and their entire family and community. He adds his name to the list of too many officers who have given their life in the line of duty, especially over the last few years. This is a hearing on gun violence, and it's true that gun violence has increased, especially over this past year. In fact, all types of violence have gone up. Murders are up more than 20% in the last year alone, a single year increase not seen in modern history. And murders have reached totals nationwide not seen since the 1990s. Now, our friends on the left always want to go straight to gun control as the solution for reducing this problem of violence. Before we start looking at controlling the rights of law-abiding citizens and regulating their guns and even setting the grounds to confiscate their guns, why don't we look at why this violence has increased to begin with? Notably, there has been extended, systematic attacks on our police and law enforcement professionals for years, calling them racist and bigoted and prejudiced, demanding that they be defunded and replaced with social workers. When you condemn the police, when you make it harder to do their job, you shouldn't be surprised that criminals take advantage of the opportunities that follow, and that crime rises, and that in particular, violent crime rises. Likewise, some on the left like to complain about mass incarceration, as if there are too many people locked up in our prisons, when more than half of all violent crimes don't even result in an arrest, much less a prosecution or a conviction. Let me tell you a story about Hassan Elliott in Philadelphia, who's a member of the 1700 gang that's responsible for many mass murders. In June of 2017, he was arrested on a firearms charge after threatening a neighbor with a gun. Despite the criminal record, he only received 7 months in jail. He then violated his parole, he failed drug tests, he was arrested with cocaine, yet he was not sent back to jail. And a few months later, he allegedly murdered someone with a gun when he should have been in jail. Later, he also murdered a police officer. All of this was preventable if prosecutors had simply followed the law and supported their local police and locked up Mr. Elliott, as they should lock up so many other violent felons across the country. So what should we do to reduce gun violence? The solution is simple. We should support our police, we should enforce our laws, and we should, yes, lock up criminals. What we should never do is create new, vague laws to restrict the constitutional rights of law-abiding gun owners. All of these new restrictions fail to stop criminals from breaking the law, but they do result in liability for Arkansans and Americans who responsibly own guns to protect themselves from the same criminals that are getting away without real jail time to commit crimes against innocent civilians when they should be locked away. Mr. Chang, it is well known that minority communities are disproportionately the victims of these violent crimes, including gun homicides. If bills like these two House-passed gun control measures were to pass, which group would suffer more? Criminals who are trying to get guns, often through illegal means, with which to commit crimes, or law-abiding citizens, especially minorities, who would like to purchase guns for self-defense?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Yeah, the group that would surely suffer the most at the hands of gun control bills would be minorities who need to defend themselves, and the ones that want to purchase a firearm for self-defense. And I'd like to share a story about what's been happening in my hometown of San Francisco, where we've had multiple attacks on not just Asian Americans, but vile, disgusting attacks have been happening to the elderly Asian Americans. And they have been kicked and pushed and hit from behind, and some have succumbed to their injuries. And to your point, we have a district attorney who is somehow trying to rationalize a murder by saying things like the criminal had a temper tantrum. I don't understand how our district attorney and the Oakland police chief right across the bay, who says that we shouldn't defend ourselves, that we should just be good witnesses. Well, you can't be a good witness when you're dead. And if the public does not have the confidence in the law enforcement machine that has the power to arrest, convict, and jail criminals for their actions, then that causes even more distress and more of a problem in our society.
Thank you, Mr. Chang, and thank you for raising the problem of your George Soros-funded prosecuting attorney, one of many across the country who refuses to enforce the law and lock away violent criminals. It's a problem about which I'll be speaking more at length in the future.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colleagues, want to raise a topic and a frame that I don't believe has been raised thus far in this hearing. For most states, the age required to legally purchase a rifle and the age required to cast a ballot are both 18. However, there's some shocking disparities in legal state requirements for obtaining a weapon versus casting a ballot. In 25 states, voters must be registered and have specific forms of ID in order to cast a ballot. But those same states allow people to buy rifles without permits and require no background checks for some sales. Additionally, in a majority of states, new voters are able to obtain a rifle quicker than they're able to cast their first ballot. It seems to me that we have our priorities entirely backwards when it comes to this, when we make it easier to buy a gun than we do to cast a ballot. Two questions for Mr. Rogers. Broadly, what does it say to you that we make it so much easier in so many states in this country to buy a gun than we do to let people vote, eligible citizens? And second, maybe more specific to your experience, given your efforts to address the trauma and racial disparities at the community level, could you discuss your approach to gun violence as a systemic trauma, physical, mental, and otherwise?